Hi, this is talk number 4 in this series of talks about mental imagery, and today I want to talk about the epistemic and general kind of far-reaching philosophical implications of all this. So in the first talk I talked about what I take to be mental imagery, and that's perceptual processing that is not triggered by corresponding sensory stimulation in the relevant sense modality. In the second talk, I talked about the reasons to think that mental imagery plays an extremely important role in our everyday perception, and in the third talk, I talked about an even more important reason to think that mental imagery plays an important role in our everyday perception, and it had to do with multimodal mental imagery. And today, I want to talk about the epistemic implications of all this. So. And for that, I need to make yet another distinction within the category of mental imagery. And remember that in the first video, I made these 5 orthogonal distinctions between different kinds of mental imagery. I want to make another one now, and that's about whether the mental imagery is triggered in a top-down or in a bottom-up way. And we've seen that some of the examples that I talked about, and I talked about this a little bit about when we talked about amodal completion. In the case of some instances of mental imagery, it's clearly fully bottom-up driven. So what's going on is that, all right, the perceptual processing is not triggered by corresponding sensory stimulation, but it's triggered by sensory stimulation around the part of the retina where there is no corresponding sensory stimulation. So this is clearly what's going on in the blind spot, for example. So in the case of the blind spot, there's very little top-down influences there. The kind of perceptual processing that is not triggered by corresponding sensory stimulation in the visual sense modality is not going to be triggered by anything top-down. It's going to be triggered by the sensory stimulation around the blind spot. And the same is true for some cases of amodal completion. So in those cases when there's very simple Gestalt rules completing a figure, in those cases what's happening is that nothing top-down is involved. What's happening is that it's the purely bottom-up sensory stimulation around the area that you're completing amodally that's responsible for the amodal completion. But in some other cases, there is a serious top-down influence. And so here is a top-down example of multimodal completion. So if you've been listening to me talking for a while, and if I do like this, no, that's not good. If I'm just gonna start. If you mute your computer, but you kind of keep looking at me, you're going to hear in your mind's ear my voice with my funny accent. So that's clearly top down. I mean, if you had not heard me before, then you would not be having that kind of auditory sensory stimulation. And there's again a fair amount of empirical findings how higher levels of perceptual processing and even non-perceptual processing influence early levels of perceptual processing. Good, so mental imagery can be triggered in a top-down or in a bottom-up way. So far, so good. What I want to talk about is how that's going to influence various debates about perception and top-down influences on perception. So there's been a very controversial issue about whether there are top-down influences on perception. I think there are really 2 very independent debates there. One of them is about perceptual experiences, whether perceptual experiences are cognitively penetrable. I don't like that term, so I'm just going to say influenced in a top-down manner. And the other debate is about whether perceptual processing is influenced by top-down mental processes. So these are very different questions, because when we talk about perceptual phenomenology, that's just about the phenomenal feel, how it feels to be perceiving something, whether that's sensitive to top-down influences. And in the case of perceptual processing, that's going to be the phenomenology is going to be completely irrelevant. Those perceptual processing may or may not be conscious. Nonetheless, the question is whether it's influenced by in a top-down manner. So I don't really like the debate about perceptual phenomenology there, partly because in order to have any kind of serious answer to that question, we would need to have some rock-solid way of keeping apart perceptual and non-perceptual phenomenology, and frankly, I don't think that we have a rock-solid way of keeping apart perceptual and non-perceptual phenomenology. But if we don't have that, then it's just not going to be a meaningful debate. So really what I take to be the real question about top-down influence on perception is whether perceptual processing is influenced in a top-down manner. So in the case of early perceptual processing, let's say a primary visual cortex, whether that's influenced by later perceptual processing, like V4 or MT, or even further kind of non-perceptual processes. Now, what I want to say here is that if you plug in mental imagery into this debate, then you get some, then you can make some kind of progress. So we've seen that mental imagery can be kind of triggered top-down or bottom-up way, and can be sensitive to top-down or bottom-up influences. If it's also true, as I argued extensively, that everyday perception is constitutively dependent on mental imagery in the vast majority of cases, then if you put these two claims together, it seems that perception itself, at least in the vast majority of cases, can be sensitive to top-down influences. So good, I mean, okay, we have some kind of argument for top-down influences on perception. What follows from this? One reason why philosophers have been interested in this issue about top-down influences on perception has to do with epistemic consequences. So one thing that perception is supposed to do is to track the truth. And one thing that knowledge is supposed to do is also to track the truth. And many philosophers of perception, not so much me, they're really interested in perception because of epistemology, because they're interested in knowledge. So all right, but then we may have a problem. So perceptual justification is supposed to be the process whereby a perceptual state justifies a belief. So the belief, in some sense, depends on the content of the beliefs. In some sense, depends on the content of the perceptual state. Now, if you also get the influence the other way around, namely, what you see is going to depend on your beliefs and knowledge, then you get some kind of vicious circularity when your perception influences your belief and your belief influences your perception. Now, I'm really not sure that this is a actual real problem. I'm wondering whether this is really about the perceptual phenomenology version of the top-down influences on perception as opposed to the perceptual processes version. But what I want to do is to give you another reason. So not the top-down influence reason, but another reason for wondering about perceptual justification if you accept the kind of picture that I outlined here. And it's this: mental imagery, regardless of whether it's top-down or bottom-up, is just going to be one step removed from the world. So perception tracks the truth, tracks the world. Knowledge is supposed to track the world, but if it is but mental imagery isn't. Mental imagery is something. It's a perceptual processing that is not triggered by corresponding sensory stimulation. So it is clearly one step removed from the sensory stimulation, which is the kind of thing that has a causal link to whatever is in front of us. So if it is true, as I argued, that perception, the vast majority of perceptual processes, are going to be constitutively dependent on mental imagery. So the kind of picture then we have a problem. Then we have a problem for perceptual justification. So the kind of picture of perception that comes out of all this is this: some of perception is driven by sensory stimulation. Some other parts of perception are not. They're driven by mental imagery, by perceptual processing that is not triggered by corresponding sensory stimulation. So every instance of perceiving is going to be a mix between sensory stimulation-driven processes and non-sensory stimulation-driven processes. But if that's the case, then given that there is always a non-sensory stimulation-driven perceptual process playing a very important role in perceiving, then because of that process, we really have some serious reasons to think that perception per se is not going to automatically track what's in front of us, track the world. But then that's going to be a very risky thing to base your beliefs on. Now, should this lead to some kind of skepticism? No, it shouldn't. So I think that many instances of mental imagery, although they are one step removed from sensory stimulation, are very reliable. One example is the blind spot. So first of all, the whole blind spot thing happens only if you close one of your eyes. And even then, the mechanism that is used for filling in the blind spot, the mechanism that uses sensory stimulation information around the blind spot in order to give perceptual processing of the missing sensory input of the blind spot, is very reliable. It's very, very difficult to create an artificial scenario when things go wrong. So in that case, there is mental imagery involved, but nonetheless that doesn't jeopardize the reliability of perception. But things are a little different when it comes to amodal completion and multimodal perception. Remember the example for amodal completion when you completed the bench behind me as a bench, although they were actually two chairs? In that case, amodal completion just gets it wrong. It just gets it wrong. And that does happen. And that also happens in the multimodal case. So what I want to argue for is that we should go case by case and examine those instances of mental imagery that are involved in everyday perception and check how reliable they are. Some of them are going to be very reliable, like the one about the blind spot. Some of them are going to be less reliable. And so we can't really give an answer, kind of a uniform yes or a uniform no answer to the question about how reliable perceptual justification is going to be. We have to go through the empirical literature on a case-by-case basis and check how reliable the mental imagery that's involved in the perceptual processing is. So this is going to give us a version of naturalized epistemology, a fairly weak version, but a version of naturalized epistemology. Thanks, and next time I'm going to talk about the application of all this to art. Bye.